The first thing that appears on screen is not a map or a missile. It's a question. What happens if China invades Taiwan? Not as a Twitter argument, not as a war game in a think tank PDF, but as a real event with real ships, real pilots, and real consequences that spill far beyond this narrow strip of ocean. To understand that future, we have to rewind to the last time Beijing tried to scare Taiwan into line, and Washington answered with steel. The last time America could scare China. The summer of 1995. On China's southeast coast, in the province of Fujian, train after train pulls in loaded with troops and equipment. On nearby beaches, artillery rolls into position. Offshore, ships begin to maneuver. Then, on television, the message appears in the form Beijing likes best: missiles. China starts test-firing ballistic missiles into the waters near Taiwan and makes sure the entire world can watch. Broadcasters replay the launches in slow motion. Commentators talk openly about exercises simulating an attack across the 130-kilometer-wide Taiwan Strait. It's not subtle. These drills mirror what an actual invasion might look like: missiles first, then ships, then troops crossing a choppy gray stretch of water to reach a self-governed island that Beijing insists is not a country at all, just a rebellious province from a civil war that never truly ended. In Beijing's narrative, there is one China. Taiwan is part of it. Full stop. But in 1995, something is happening on that rebellious province that terrifies the people in Zhongnanhai. Taiwan's president wants to visit the United States, and Taiwan is about to hold its first fully democratic presidential election in 5,000 years of Chinese political history. Congress in Washington votes to grant the visa. Cameras in Taipei capture bustling rallies, campaign flags, people lining up to hear speeches and cast votes. In Beijing, it looks like this: a Chinese leader, elected freely on Chinese soil and recognized, even informally, by the United States. That's not just an insult, it's a precedent. So China reaches for the lever it knows: military theater, missile tests, live fire drills, state TV showing amphibious assault exercises that look suspiciously like how to storm a contested beach. News anchors around the world run the footage on loop. Another round of Chinese war games near Taiwan has the U.S. and others concerned. The point is simple: intimidate the voters. Remind them that even if they choose their own president, there's still a giant neighbor across the water claiming the right to decide their future. But then, something else appears on the horizon. Not Chinese ships, American ones. The era when U.S. power wasn't a question. Washington decides to respond with its own form of theater. President Clinton orders the biggest show of U.S. military force in Asia since the Vietnam War. 2 carrier strike groups, the floating symbols of U.S. power, steam toward the region. Alongside them, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, submarines. The full package. These aren't just ships, they're a message wrapped in steel. U.S. carrier groups move right up to the waters near Taiwan, passing through the strait like a slow-moving warning label: China, we are stronger than you, back off. This is the 1990s. China's economy is growing, but its military is still mostly coastal, still catching up. The U.S. Navy is uncontested. There's no serious debate about whose fleet dominates the Pacific. So when those American carriers show up, Beijing blinks. The exercises wind down, tensions ease, Taiwan holds its election. The United States walks away feeling like it proved something. That it can still police the world, that aircraft carriers and a firm statement from the White House are enough to make a rising power back off. For a moment, it looks like the script is simple. China rattles sabers, America sails in, crisis averted. But history rarely replays that neatly. Fast forward, the sky fills with map lines. Jump forward about 25 years. Same players, same stretch of water, very different balance of power. Instead of missiles dropping into the sea on live TV, the pressure now shows up as lines on a map. China's new favorite way to remind Taiwan who's boss is to send military aircraft into a zone of airspace that surrounds the island, Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. And ADIZ isn't sovereignty, it's a buffer. If you fly into it, you're supposed to identify yourself, give your intentions, cooperate with air traffic and defense authorities. If you don't, the country whose ADIZ you've entered has to assume the worst, that you might be coming to attack. Starting around 2020, Chinese planes begin crossing into Taiwan's ADIZ at a pace no one has seen before. What used to be occasional political signaling becomes routine pressure. By 2021, Taiwan's defense ministry has logged thousands of PLA sorties probing the zone, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Not once or twice a month, dozens of times a day. Fighter jets, bombers, electronic warfare planes, sometimes they skirt the edge of the zone, other times they cut straight across. If you plot every flight on a map, you don't see random noise. You see a pattern. Loops southwest of the island, arcs that push closer and closer to key choke points, lines that stretch out to Taiwan's east, the direction reinforcement from the US and Japan would come from in a war. It is essentially a slow-motion rehearsal. Taiwan responds at first the way doctrine says it should, scrambling jets, locking radars, tracking every intruder. But this burns fuel, pilot hours, and a defense budget that is a fraction of China's. By 2020, Taipei is spending nearly 9% of its entire defense budget just on reacting to Chinese flyovers, and eventually has to change tactics, relying more on ground-based missiles and tracking systems. Global Taiwan Institute. Imagine a bully ringing your doorbell 100 times a day. You can't call the police every time. Eventually, you just stop answering. And that's part of the point. These flights do three things at once. They normalize Chinese military presence around Taiwan. They map and stress test Taiwan's responses. And they send a daily psychological message. You are surrounded. You are vulnerable. Your skies are not truly your own. And just like in the 1990s, whenever things start getting too intense, the world looks to see who will show up next. The old script stops working. In early October, during the week when China celebrates the founding of the People's Republic, the number of incursions spikes. Analysts track record-breaking days, 38 planes, 39, then more. It's like a drumbeat. A state-run Chinese outlet puts it into words with brutal clarity. The headline essentially says, "Time to warn Taiwan secessionists, war is real." This isn't quiet, behind-the-scenes pressure, this is loud. So the United States reaches for the familiar move. Send in the ships. Guided missile destroyers sail through the Taiwan Strait. Sometimes they're joined by Canadian or other allied vessels. It's framed as a freedom of navigation operation, asserting that these are international waters, not China's private lake. Television anchors read the same kind of lines you heard in the 90s. A U.S. warship has sailed through the Taiwan Strait. On paper, the script is the same. In reality, everything has changed. Because this time, the Chinese flights don't slow down, they increase. If you mark on the calendar when U.S. destroyers transit the strait and then line up the ADIZ data, you see something unsettling. The PLA simply keeps going. In some periods, they seem to push even harder afterwards. Foreign Policy Research Institute. Why does this difference matter? Because this is no longer the 1990s when China's Navy held the coast and its Air Force flew mostly within its own borders. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing has built the largest navy in the world by ship count. More than 370 battle force ships by recent U.S. estimates, on track to surpass 400. Congress.gov. Quantity isn't everything. U.S. ships are bigger, more heavily armed, more experienced. But in a confined battle space like the Taiwan Strait, numbers matter. As one analysis put it, in a small patch of ocean, mass is firepower. And it's not just about Taiwan anymore. While Chinese aircraft are pressing Taiwan's ADIZ, Chinese Coast Guard vessels are also showing up near the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, disputed rocks in the East China Sea administered by Japan. In 2024, Japan recorded record-high Chinese government ship activity around those islands, more than 1,300 ships in a single year. Tokyo, bound by a security treaty that obliges the U.S. to defend territories under the administration of Japan, quietly becomes another piece on the same chessboard. By late 2025, the U.S. Army is deploying new Typhoon missile batteries in Japan, capable of firing long-range cruise and anti-air missiles, specifically to deter Chinese military moves in these contested waters. Japan's government publicly debates how far it would go if China attacked Taiwan, and Chinese officials warn of consequences if Japan gets involved. The geography hasn't changed. The physics of missiles and ships haven't changed. But the balance of risk has. When U.S. ships sail through the strait now, they're not just making a statement. They're brushing against a military that is planned, drilled, and grown precisely to make those old American moves feel dangerous. Why this difference matters. So why spend so much time on these flyovers, these ship numbers, these war games? Because the difference between 1995 and today is the difference between a crisis that ends in a press conference and one that tumbles into something much darker. In the 90s, Chinese leadership could stage a few dramatic exercises, get its point across, and still back down without losing face. The PLA simply wasn't ready for a serious fight with the United States. Today, Chinese planners look at a very different ledger. A navy that is, by some measures, larger than America's. An air force that flies long-range bomber patrols and stealth fighters around Taiwan. A network of missiles along the coast designed specifically to keep U.S. carriers at arm's length. And over all of this hangs a piece of domestic legislation that quietly hard-codes the logic of force, China's anti-secession law. Passed in 2005, it says that if Taiwan formally moves toward independence, or if the possibilities for peaceful reunification are completely exhausted, Beijing shall employ non-peaceful means and other necessary measures to defend its claimed sovereignty. It doesn't give the Chinese government permission to use force. It gives it an obligation. At the same time, in Taiwan, support for any kind of political reunification with the mainland has sunk to historic lows. Each generation feels more Taiwanese and less Chinese. The idea that this island will simply merge back into the People's Republic by choice looks less and less plausible. On one side, a law that says, eventually you must act. On the other, a society that says, we will not be absorbed. That tension is the dry grass. The ADIZ flights, the warships, the missiles are the sparks moving closer and closer to it. And that's why, if we want to understand what happens if China invades Taiwan, and what the US, Japan, and the rest of the region do in response, we have to look carefully at how that fire might start. Not because war is inevitable, but because once these things begin, they are very hard to stop. In the next part, we'll go to the desk, not the beach. We'll look at the documents, the war plans, and the first minutes of a scenario that Chinese and American planners have been gaming out for years. A full-scale attempt to seize Taiwan by force, and how quickly that could pull in the world's biggest militaries. The thing about modern war is that it rarely announces itself. When missiles fly, when ships mobilize, when soldiers rush to positions, the public often sees it as the start. But in reality, wars start months, sometimes years earlier, in strategies drafted behind closed doors, in laws that quietly bind leaders to decisions no one wants to make, in political pressures that grow unaddressed until they snap. And in the case of Taiwan, one of those quiet triggers sits not on a map, but on a page. The law that makes peace temporary. On my desk is a document that Chinese planners study the way lawyers study precedent. This is China's anti-secession law, passed in 2005 during a time when Taiwan was experimenting with stronger assertions of political identity. The law outlines what Beijing considers its red lines. It says, if Taiwan declares independence, China must act. If peaceful options are exhausted, China must act. And when China acts, it will use non-peaceful means. This is not a policy. It's an obligation. The law gives the Chinese government something dangerous, a legal justification for war, ready to be invoked whenever Beijing decides diplomacy has stalled. And over the past decade, China's leaders, from President Xi Jinping to top PLA commanders, have begun speaking more openly about reunification as something that cannot be postponed forever. At the same time, polling in Taiwan shows exactly the opposite trend. The younger the voter, the stronger their support for maintaining the island's de facto independence. Many identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese, and reject the idea of joining the People's Republic under any political arrangement. Two trajectories, moving in opposite directions, toward a collision point. If that collision ever becomes kinetic, if China chooses force, the first moments wouldn't look like a Hollywood opening shot. They'd look like just another Chinese ADIZ violation. The first minutes, when normal looks suspicious. Picture this. It's a gray morning over the Taiwan Strait. Nothing dramatic, no sirens, no explosions, just the low vibration of military jets moving across the water, something that has already happened hundreds of times in 2021, 2022, 2023, to the point where Taiwanese military doesn't scramble fighters for every incursion anymore. China has normalized its presence so thoroughly that the line between signal and attack has blurred. So when Taiwanese radar screens show another group of PLA jets entering the southwestern corner of the island's ADIZ, nobody panics. This is the trick. The jets look routine. Their altitude looks routine. Their formation could be routine. Then, just as they cross the invisible threshold where Taiwan usually expects them to turn away, one formation doesn't. It banks inward and fires. Almost simultaneously, from China's coastline, dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles streak into the sky. Some aim for air bases, some target naval facilities, others hit radar installations, command hubs, power stations, or key communication nodes. The attack is fast, dense, and coordinated. Chinese planners call this system destruction warfare. The idea that a modern military doesn't need to be defeated soldier by soldier, tank by tank. It only needs to have its critical functions shattered. Break the radar, blind the air defense, cut command lines. After that, an army is just people with weapons, not a coherent force. It is the same logic Russia used in the opening moments of its invasion of Ukraine. It is the logic the US used in Iraq in 2003.
And it is the logic China has studied relentlessly for 20 years. The point of this first strike is not to conquer Taiwan, it's to paralyze it. It's to make sure that by the time the rest of the world understands what's happening, it's already too late to stop. Taiwan's first response: survive the opening blow. Taiwan's top officials retreat to a hardened underground bunker, something like South Korea's famous Blue House bunker, but even more hidden. These structures were designed for this exact scenario: keep Taiwan's leadership alive long enough to coordinate a response. Yes, many of Taiwan's surface-level assets would be hit hard. Runways are visible from space. Naval ports are easy targets. Radar towers cannot hide. But Taiwan has spent decades preparing for this. Hidden in mountains are aircraft hangars carved into rock. Concealed across the island are mobile missile launchers designed to survive and shoot back. Some of Taiwan's anti-ship systems are disguised in decoy buildings, fake warehouses, unmarked trucks. China's opening strikes would hit many targets, but not all. And Taiwan only needs some capability to respond. From the surviving units, Taiwan launches missiles towards Chinese air bases and early warning radars. Their purpose is not to cripple China. Taiwan cannot do that, but to slow China, to force the PLA to commit more resources to defending the mainland instead of pushing across the strait. At the same time, Taiwanese engineers rush to lay underwater mines along likely landing zones, especially near Taiwan, Tainan, and the western coastal plains where Chinese amphibious units would aim to land. These preparations buy time, but time is precisely what Taiwan doesn't have. Because while this is happening, China is already executing the most dangerous part of its plan: the crossing. 130 kilometers of chaos. Across the strait, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops are loading onto every vessel China can muster. Not just military amphibious craft, but civilian ferries, commercial roll-on, roll-off ships, cargo vessels, fishing fleets commandeered for military use. China's Navy alone doesn't have the amphibious lift capacity to move enough troops in one wave, but its enormous civilian fleet gives China a solution: military-civil fusion, a doctrine that turns China's commercial infrastructure into wartime assets. This is what Japan used in the 1930s. It is what Russia attempted in the Black Sea, and it is what China has practiced for years. China doesn't need every ship to be armed. It only needs enough to deliver soldiers and supplies faster than Taiwan can destroy them. This crossing is the most vulnerable moment for China: 130 kilometers of open water, a bottleneck of ships, slow-moving and exposed, all reliant on the assumption that Taiwan is too stunned and the U.S. too slow to intervene effectively. And for the United States, those first hours are a nightmare. The U.S. discovers it's been blinded. Washington gets the first reports through fragmented channels: Taiwanese emergency pings, early satellite alerts, intelligence intercepts that look chaotic and incomplete. Part of the reason is simple: China would jam communications heavily. But part of the reason is more alarming. China has spent the last decade developing anti-satellite capabilities. Some are missiles, some are lasers, some are small inspection satellites that can sidle up to a U.S. reconnaissance satellite and blind, disrupt, or block its sensors. China calls these orbital service vehicles. The Pentagon calls them something else: weapons. And if even a few U.S. spy satellites are temporarily blinded, Washington's early warning picture becomes foggy at the worst possible moment. The President of the United States now faces a decision that no leader wants: send American forces into a fight with a nuclear-armed superpower, or stand back and watch a democratic partner be crushed. Both options have consequences. Both could define the century. And while Washington debates what to do next, something else happens, something that expands the crisis far beyond Taiwan.
The war spills into Japan. China knows that if war comes, the U.S. would likely launch air operations from bases in Japan and Guam. So, in the darkest version of Beijing's strategy, China hits those bases first, trying to delay American intervention by destroying runways, fuel depots, and parked aircraft before they can take off. This step is not guaranteed, but it is part of several PLA wargame scenarios, and Japanese officials know it. And Japan has been preparing. Over the last few years, Japan activated new military units on its southern islands. It deployed long-range anti-ship missiles aimed at the Strait. It allowed the U.S. to station advanced missile systems on its soil. And it openly stated that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would threaten Japan's national survival. This means that the moment China targets U.S. bases in Japan, even with a symbolic strike, Tokyo is no longer a bystander. Japan becomes a combatant, which means the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty activates. And the war, which began as a strike on Taiwan, now includes Taiwan, China, the United States, and Japan. 4 of the world's largest economies, all nuclear adjacent, locked into a conflict in one of the most densely militarized waterways on Earth. And this is where everything becomes truly unpredictable. In Part 3, we'll enter the phase that every strategist fears, the moment when multiple great powers collide, when escalation becomes a chain reaction, and when a regional conflict risks becoming a global fracture point. We'll explore how the U.S. would fight in the Strait, how China plans to counter it, why Taiwan's geography is both a shield and a curse, and what it means when nuclear-armed nations stare into the abyss. At this point, the Taiwan Strait is no longer just a narrow stretch of water. It's a gravitational well, a place where decisions made in minutes can alter decades, a place where miscalculation isn't a risk, it's the default. Because once China's first waves of troops begin landing on Taiwan's western beaches, once U.S. and Japanese bases are either struck or threatened, and once American warships begin moving toward the strait, the conflict enters a stage that keeps military planners awake at night. Escalation without control. Not escalation by choice. Not escalation by strategy, but escalation because the machinery of war, once moving, is almost impossible to stop. This is the phase the Pentagon calls the long, dark hallway. A moment when no one knows what's waiting at the other end. The U.S. arrives, and the Strait changes character. When Washington finally commits to intervention, the U.S. doesn't send soldiers first. It sends steel and silence. Carriers, submarines, long-range bombers from Guam and Hawaii, stealth aircraft launched from undisclosed locations. The goal is not to reach Taiwan. It's to choke the strait, to make it impossible for China to reinforce its landing force. China's greatest vulnerability in this war is not its mainland. It's the stretch of ocean where its ships are exposed. U.S. Navy submarines, which have trained for decades to break through anti-access defenses, would likely head directly toward Chinese shipping lanes. Submarines don't need air support. They don't care about missile batteries on shore. And once they get within firing range, they can unleash torpedoes capable of sinking massive troop carriers in minutes. If even a handful of U.S. subs break into the strait, they can create a nightmare scenario for China. a drowning invasion force with no ability to pull back. But China knows this. It has prepared one of the densest missile networks in the world along its coastline, stretching from Fujian to Zhejiang. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, like the DF-21D and DF-26, are designed specifically to push U.S. carriers far from the fight. Chinese military analysts call these weapons carrier killers. American planners call them something else: the end of guaranteed air superiority. This is the terrifying part. The United States has never fought a modern war against a peer power with precision missiles capable of sinking billion-dollar ships from hundreds of miles away. The entire U.S. military presence in Asia is suddenly operating in a zone where the old assumptions don't apply. The air war. A sky without masters. Taiwan's Air Force, battered but not broken, scrambles what it can. Surviving F-16s and indigenous defense fighters launch from mountain tunnels and hidden bases. They aim to strike Chinese ships, disrupt troop concentrations, and slow the advance inland. At the same time, the United States deploys stealth aircraft, F-22s, F-35s, possibly B-2 bombers if runways remain intact. But the airspace around Taiwan becomes one of the most hostile zones in the world. China's Air Force sends waves of J-20 stealth fighters and J-16 multi-role jets into the fight. Long-range Chinese bombers carrying anti-ship missiles fly in tight, coordinated formations. Electronic warfare planes jam communications. Drones swarm ahead of manned aircraft, mapping U.S. and Taiwanese responses. The sky fills with so much radar noise, jamming, and electronic deception that pilots begin speaking of the airspace not as contested, but chaotic. This is not the Middle East. This is not Afghanistan. This is not the Iraq War. This is air combat against a nation that has spent trillions building systems to defeat America's systems. In this chaos, things go wrong. They always do. A U.S. plane gets too close to China's coastline. A Chinese missile battery mistakes a Japanese aircraft for an American one. A Taiwanese missile locks onto a radar signature it can't identify fast enough. And the war grows. Not intentionally, not strategically, but because in a fight this dense, no one can see everything. The ground war is a nightmare for both sides. If Chinese forces reach Taiwan's beaches, and in most scenarios they do, the ground war becomes brutal and slow. Taiwan is not Iraq, not Afghanistan, not a desert, not a flat plain. Taiwan is mountainous, urban, packed with narrow streets, dense with civilians, filled with choke points, and highly defensible for anyone familiar with the terrain. It is in many ways a fortress disguised as an island. Chinese forces landing at first would have momentum. They would establish beachheads, push inland, attempt to seize ports and airports to bring in more troops. But then the geography begins fighting back. Taiwanese forces retreat into interior defenses, tunnels, and urban positions built for this exact scenario. Every road becomes a kill zone. Every intersection becomes an ambush point. Every bridge is rigged for demolition. In a chilling parallel, analysts often compare a Chinese landing to the U.S. Marines' fight for Fallujah, or the Battle of Mosul, except with far more sophisticated weapons on both sides. Urban combat is slow, bloody, resource-intensive, and nearly impossible to win cleanly. Chinese planners know this. They dread this. But the political mandate in Beijing would be absolute. Take the island. And Taiwan's mandate would be equally absolute. Do not fall. There is no middle ground. Japan enters, and a new front opens. While fighting rages on Taiwan, Japan faces its own crisis. If China struck U.S. bases in Japan, or even if it only threatened them, Japan becomes fully committed. Its self-defense forces activate emergency war plans. Japan's southwestern islands, Yonaguni, Miyakojima, Ishigaki, lie dangerously close to Taiwan. Some are less than 70 miles away. China would see these islands as staging grounds for U.S. reinforcements. Japan would see them as shields against Chinese expansion, and both nations would fight to control them. This opens a second front, a front where Japanese anti-ship missiles target Chinese vessels. Chinese aircraft attempt to suppress Japanese defenses. U.S. and Japanese navies coordinate to hold the East China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia swarm contested waters near the Senkakus. The region becomes a maze of overlapping claims, wartime calculations, and deep historical wounds. The ghosts of World War II, long dormant, begin to stir. And now, the battlefield includes Taiwan, China, Japan, the United States. 4 nations that combined represent almost 40% of the global economy. And beyond them, more sparks are waiting. India watches, and the Himalayas shake. As China becomes consumed with war in the east, a cold wind moves through the Himalayas. India. The two nations have clashed repeatedly along their disputed border. An ongoing standoff has brought tens of thousands of soldiers to the line of actual control. Indian strategists know that a distracted China is a vulnerable China. And Chinese military writings openly warn that in a Taiwan war, India might take advantage of the chaos to push its own territorial claims. Some Chinese analysts even predict Tibetan uprisings in the West, border incursions from Indian forces, a multi-front conflict that stretches China thin. Suddenly, China, a nation that prefers overwhelming local dominance, could face war on 2 fronts. And the more fronts that open, the more unpredictable the situation becomes. The possibility no one wants to say out loud. When conflicts escalate, they follow patterns. Pressure to counterpressure. Strike to retaliation. Escalation to escalation. And when nuclear-armed nations escalate, the world steps into territory it has only entered twice. China has nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear weapons. Both have submarines that can launch missiles no one can intercept. Japan hosts U.S. nuclear assets. And India, also a nuclear power, suddenly becomes part of the equation. This is how a war over Taiwan, an island smaller than Switzerland, could ignite a chain reaction that reshapes the world. Not because anyone wants that outcome, but because wars create momentum, and momentum creates decisions no leader ever planned to make. The most likely reality. Here's the part no one likes to hear. A full-scale invasion of Taiwan is still not the most likely scenario. More likely is something below the threshold of war. A blockade, a quarantine, a cyber shutdown, a seizure of offshore islands, a slow strangling of Taiwan's economy, coercion of shipping and air routes. But what makes the invasion scenario worth analyzing, what makes it terrifying, is that it remains possible. And if it ever begins, it will be one of the hardest wars to stop. Because unlike past conflicts, this one begins with superpowers already aligned against each other, already suspicious, already preparing. And when kinetic war breaks out between China and the United States, no treaty, no UN resolution, no diplomatic back channel can guarantee a clean exit. This is why Taiwan is not just another conflict. It is the test. A test of whether the world's great powers can manage rivalry without catastrophe. A test of whether the 21st century will repeat the 20th or break the pattern. And a reminder that peace is not normal. Peace is precious. Peace is rare. Peace is built every day, in choices, in restraint, in imagination. If Taiwan becomes the spark of something larger, it will not be because one side wanted war. It will be because neither side understood how quickly a spark becomes a wildfire. And because once that wildfire starts, no one, not Beijing, not Washington, not Tokyo, can control where the flames spread.